who has been such a dear sister friend. She is the founder of the district school. And I need to share a personal testimony of how we came to meet, which just shows how, if you believe in a higher power or not, something providential happened in this. My daughter takes ballet at the Washington Ballet, and one of the founding board members is also there, a lady who was just so hilarious and fun. And we were just sitting there talking and waiting for our kids to, I think, get dressed for the spring performance. And somehow we just started talking, and she was talking about, hey, she and a group of people are starting a school. This was several years ago. I was like, oh, what's the name of it? She said the district school. I said, oh, I love that. Long story short, she wanted to know who I was, what I did. She said, wait, what is your name? And I said, Anika. She said, are you Anika Prather? I said, yes. She said, oh my gosh, we've been told we had to talk to you.
Yeah.
And there we were. And we've become friends and sisters. I've taken my students at Catholic U to come observe the school. And the reason why I'm saying this is a personal level, and I know she'll share more about her work, it's just important for me because um, I feel like her school embodies what I'm trying to do with redefining classics. A lot of times we see classical education kind of still split. We see either a school that is predominantly European American with maybe a couple of families of color who are invited into the space. And oftentimes nothing has been done in that space to show this belongs to everyone. There's that. And then the other narrative is you have a group of people that start a classical school that goes into a predominantly African American community, and it's predominantly African American, and everything is just geared towards the African American narrative. This is not a critique of both spaces, so please don't leave here and say that, because I value classical education wherever it's done. It is so essential. But what I didn't see is kind of like this space where we were all together enjoying this tradition, bringing our stories to be woven into this tradition together. And Jacqueline's, the district school, if you visit it, you will see that and the field school is very similar to this as well, run by Jeremy Mann, and he'll be speaking at the May 24th event, a very intentional effort to bring all of us together around the tradition. And sometimes you can't do that, right? So that's why this is not a critique of the other two ways. I'm just saying that this way is also missing, right? Depending on where you're located in the world and what passion you feel a mission to do, that's what you do. But this little niche of where we're all gathered together around the tradition and our children are being educated together around the tradition or inspired by the tradition is something I love seeing with Jacqueline. So Jacqueline, I will be quiet and I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you for the beautiful introduction. I'm going to try, I'm not very good at screen sharing, so give me a minute to, let's see if the presenter view, does that show you all just the slides, or are you also seeing my notes?
We are seeing your notes as well.
Okay, okay. Not that you can't read what I'm going to say, but it will take away from the conversation. So let me try one more time. Okay, we'll do it this way. Hi, everybody. I'm Jackie. And yeah, Anika and I met really providentially. We've been trying to connect with her and had the opportunity to do so when she ran into one of our board members at a ballet class. So it was so beautiful to see how the Lord works. I have been in Washington, D.C. for my whole adult life and started teaching and have spent all my career up until this point in time in the public school system. So my very first teaching job was actually, I heard Shannon talk at the beginning about Dunbar. I taught at Dunbar Senior High School as my very first teaching position in DC, and worked at a handful of public and charter schools, mostly in the secondary grades. And never thought I would leave the public system. I felt very committed to the public system because I saw it as the avenue through which all students would have access to a high quality education. I'm going to reshare my slides real quick so that you're just seeing the slides. And the Lord called me into this effort of being part of the founding of the district school. And I think there's no turning back now. I am also a mom of 3 children. I have a son who is a second grader at the district school. He's the one who will pop up on the screen in just a moment, giving his good friend Storm a hug. I have a first grader, Alexander, who is also a student at the district school, and I have a 3-year-old who will be a student next year at the district school. So I get to wear both the hat of educator and school leader and also parent. And I enter this conversation with a little bit of imposter syndrome. So I just wanted to be honest about that up front. Our school is very new. We started this year, so we opened on August 28th of 2024. We've been in school for about 150 days. And I'm also new to the classic world of classical education. As I mentioned, I worked in public schools and was familiar with sort of that like traditional public school curriculum. So am on very much a learning journey. So I feel grateful to be part of this conversation as a learner, and acknowledge that our school is really new. We have a vision of an intentionally diverse school community. And I'll share today a bit of some of the practices we've put in place in our first year to get to that goal and hope. But also we have a lot to learn, and we have lots of areas to grow. So also just want to acknowledge that as well. So the district school was born out of community conversations. I think it's important to know a bit of our inception story, given our newness and given how it's formed our mission. So I was called into this conversation through conversations with families. So DC is a city of choice. About half of our students in the district, the district serves around 100,000 students. About half of the students go to neighborhood public schools, and the other half go to charter schools. But there's a lottery system, so families can rank their public options, both public and charter, both neighborhood schools and schools that are outside of their neighborhood on a common lottery. And they get to rank their choices, and then the lottery happens, and families get their results with what schools they've been admitted to. So as an educator in DC for a long time, I had a lot of families reaching out to me starting in 2018 through current times, asking, how should we play the lottery? How should I think about ranking public schools for my child who's entering elementary school? And I was never consulting on that, but I turned the question around and said, well, I'd love to know more about what your hopes are for your child's education. What's most important to you when you think about their educational experience and how that forms them? And it started me on this journey of conversations with families. And to date, members of our team have interviewed over 100 families in the District of Columbia. And over the course of years, we tried to diversify the families we were talking to. So not just families who were in close, proximate relationship to us, but families from different parts of the city, from different denominations or church traditions, families from different economic backgrounds, families from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And we heard these four themes come up across those conversations. One was a desire for a Christ-centered school. The way we sort of captured that was we want to be a school where kids hear the gospel, it's explicitly taught, they experience the gospel in curriculum, in relationships, in our school culture, and then they have opportunities to practice the gospel. In DC, shockingly, in a system that serves 100,000 students, there's only 200 seats in Protestant Christian schools in the whole city. So that came out in the interviews too, that there were families who were looking for a Christ-centered education, but they didn't have a lot of options within the district. So they were then having to look to Virginia and Maryland with, depending on a family's circumstances with transportation or work, just became really impossible. The second theme that arose was this desire for an academically excellent and joy-filled education. Families had these deep hopes for their child around their love of learning, for them to be able to learn through multiple modalities, for them to be able to have impact in the school community and the broader community, for them to be prepared to think critically and biblically to navigate a complex world and city. The third one was one that gets to what we're going to talk more about today, but the sort of pillar of being intentionally diverse. We talked to, again, families from lots of different demographic backgrounds and heard this desire for a school that reflected the diversity of DC as well as the diversity of God's kingdom, which is described as multilingual, multi-ethnic. And how could we be a school community that is striving to reflect the kingdom that we know God has created? And the last one is one that's financially accessible. So in DC, the average private school elementary education costs $30,000 a year. which is an impossibility for many families and a total like out of reach for many families in our community, those especially coming from lower income households. So our hope is to make an excellent Christ-centered education accessible to families of all incomes. And this captures a quote that came up in one of our interviews. One family shared, "I imagine a school filled with Christian teachers passionate about excellence in education. I imagine a school that is affordable and welcoming for students and families from all backgrounds. This would be a dream come true, not just for me, but for this entire community." And you see some of our precious students here as well. Our mission reflects back what we heard from those family interviews and those themes I just mentioned. Our mission is to provide a vibrant and excellent Christ-centered education in a racially and economically diverse community. Through the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk more about that last part of our mission about what it means to be operating in an intentionally diverse community. So there's lots of ways to define diversity, and ours might evolve over time. But for now, we sort of put our stake in the ground around being a community that reflected racial diversity and economic diversity. And that's really at the heart of our school. So it's a pillar that we were founded on. Right now, our school, you can see the demographic makeup of it. We're about 41% white, 47% African American, and about 12% bi or multiracial. And then about 59% of our students are coming from households that qualify as lower income according to the HUD guidelines in DC. I have to move my thing so I can see better. 13% of our households are qualifying as middle income, and then 26% of our households are qualifying as higher income households. And I wanted to share this because I think it makes the case for why we saw this as important. So part of our founding, we talked to families, but we also mapped and landscaped the options. DC has a lot of educational options. So I think part of that mapping initially was trying to figure out, like, is there a need for this in our city? We hear it as a hope from families, but is there a need for this in our city? And when we looked at full-day Christ-centered schools, and we included Protestant schools, Catholic schools, and Episcopalian schools, which were the sort of three types of faith-based schools in the city, we saw this big gap in the lower right quadrant of what was available. We looked at the cost of tuition compared to the racial diversity of a school community. And I think Anika kind of highlighted that earlier. We saw a lot of schools that were very, very, very expensive, predominantly white, offered a handful of scholarships to families who were coming from lower income backgrounds, or we saw schools that were totally free, primarily serving lower income students. And we didn't feel like there was anything that was sort of, again, built around that idea of how are we creating an intentionally diverse community. And we really see intentional diversity as a gift. We believe it's so important. Schools are innately formative institutions, and this is part of the formation. An intentionally diverse community allows us to reflect the future reality of God's kingdom, as I mentioned earlier. It reminds us constantly that all people are image bearers of God, and that different perspectives or backgrounds are not obstacles, but show us a more holistic picture of the beautiful world that He created. And last but not least, cross-cultural cultural communities are formative. They form mindsets, they form habits. It encourages a lot of humility, empathy, listening, storytelling, and it shapes children for a future in what we believe is a really, really important way. So given that, we as a new community wanted to hold ourselves accountable to what we felt was most important this year. So we set goals around being Christ-centered, we set goals around offering a meaningful learning experience, and we set goals around being an intentionally diverse community. And we worked with families in our community to set these goals. So what you see here is like what we are holding ourselves accountable to this year. Again, this will change over time, I'm sure, as we grow. But this year, we like mutually agreed as a community that we wanted to be a place that was welcoming to families and students of different backgrounds, and that created an environment where families could build relationships with each other. We also wanted to be a place where families and students felt valued and heard, and where families and students' perspectives and backgrounds were honored, in the community and also in learning experiences. We wanted to be a place where our curriculum, our lessons and stories highlighted the beautiful diversity of God's created world, and that books and lessons offered windows and mirrors experiences. I heard Amber mention that earlier, and I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like for us in a bit. And then last but not least, we wanted to be a place that was open to like feedback, reflection, and we put in some practices that we call equity checks, to ensure that we weren't seeing um, uh, uh, that student outcomes were never predicted by demographic factors in our school community. So we regularly were collecting information from staff, students, and families. Quarterly, we do a phone call check-in or an in-person check-in for 15 minutes with every family. We're tiny, so it's pretty feasible right now. But we're like thinking about how we grow this as we continue to grow, and then took opportunities at the middle of the year and the end of the year to collect more robust information and data from families. We hold space for student reflection, and also hold space for staff reflection. And then, as I mentioned, I use particular protocols that encourage us to examine the impact of our practice and policies on the families that are the most vulnerable in our community. So I want to talk about 3 of those practices that we put in place aligned to those goals that we set. The one is family partnerships and storytelling. The second is explicit skill building for kids. And then third is an integrated curriculum with that windows and mirrors experience. And it's so beautiful to have listened to the earlier speakers, because so much of what you all shared, I think, is connected to what we hope to be doing as well. The idea of, Paul, I just heard you talk about belief. Like, I think we hold that there's pieces of belief that are innate. Like, we can look at people as full persons. We can look at people as created with dignity in God's image, and belief grows through depth of relationship. So I think there's a lot of pieces that feel synergistic to what people have shared earlier. So I'm going to talk briefly through each of these practices. I am a practitioner at heart, not an academic, although I love to learn. So I think these will get like really tactical into like, what does this look like in a school community? So family partnerships, we did 2 things this year, connected to a broader framework, which I'll share in a moment. But we really believed in the power of relationship, trust building, and storytelling to build relationships between educators and families. DC for a very long time was the poorest performing school district in the entire country. So many of the families that we are serving in our community grew up in a system that had failed them, and had a lot of mistrust in the system. So we have a lot of work to do to rebuild that trust and get to know families and their stories, and to share our own stories as well. So one thing we do at the beginning of the year, and I think this is becoming a more common practice across schools, which is wonderful, are family visits. So our educators go to a place of the family's choosing, whether that's their home, a park, a coffee shop, a church or a community center, and they sit down with the family just to have a relationship building conversation, to get to know them, to get to know some of their story, to share some of their own story, to get to know who their child is through their family's eyes. The kids come too. So a lot of our home visits involve the teachers playing with kids and the kids giving them a tour of their toys or putting puzzles together. But this is really based in a framework that we believe that we can't do the great work of partnering with families around a child's academic success or social emotional success without first having that trusting relationship as the foundation. So we invest time in that at the beginning of the year. And then we maintain that trust through consistent communication and with families throughout the school year. And then looking at each other as partners in supporting a child's growth. The other thing that we did this year was story circles. So we partnered with an organization in DC called Story District, and they have a mission of helping people tell their story to others, and you know, they have this deep belief in the power of stories. So we worked with them, and they came in and we hosted an evening where we offered childcare for families. We provided a meal. And our families in our community sat in a handful of circles with about 5 other people. And Story District helped facilitate the telling of our own stories. And it was just really beautiful because there was so much vulnerability in those stories. There was so much like deep knowing in those stories, lots of tears and joy in those story circles. And it was interesting because coming out of them, there was such deep, like such empathetic and much deeper connections between families in our community, particularly families who are coming from different economic backgrounds or racial backgrounds. And 2 parents in our community following the story circles wanted to continue to get together informally in adult-only settings with the families in our community. So they started this like pass the bonfire situation where one family in our community just opened her backyard up for a bonfire and for snacks and invited everyone. And again, people just were connecting and continuing to share stories and connect relationally. And then she passed that to another member of our community who the next quarter invited people to her house for an outdoor bonfire and snacks and drinks. And so it's been a really, that was not an intended impact of these story circles. I think the intention was for us to get real with each other and to know each other's stories as, again, the foundation of relationship. But it had this beautiful side effect of families have continued to do that in like informal, outside of school, adult-only settings. The second thing that we've done is explicit skill building with students. So we, like many schools, use sort of an opening circle practice in our school community that includes relationship building. And we are using a social emotional learning curriculum called The Shortest Distance that was designed by one of our founding team members. And it's called The Shortest Distance because there's a quote, and I can't remember who it's from right now, but I could follow up with that. And this individual says, the shortest distance between 2 people is a story. And this is a bibliotherapy approach to social emotional learning. So it's all based in reading stories and in people, like both staff and teachers and students telling stories. And that's coupled with explicit skill building. So knowing that we are working in an intentionally diverse school community, our very first social emotional learning unit is focused on respect and welcome. I worked briefly at a charter school in California, and it also had a vision of being an intentionally diverse community. And the way they accomplished that was through just putting a bunch of kids together who were coming from different backgrounds. And I think what they realized, I entered that school system after it had been operating for about 20 years. But in their 20th year, they came to this awakening that, oh, putting a bunch of people who come from very different backgrounds in the same room doesn't create an intentionally diverse community. And I think bringing that lesson from that last school experience, they were trying to remediate a lot of the challenges to repair relationships and build a different culture in their school community. We wanted to do that actively. We knew that bringing people together structurally wasn't enough, but it's about creating the culture and conversation that's going to be the bedrock of an intentionally diverse community. And this is one way we do it with kids. So you can see a glimpse. Here's a screenshot of some of the conversations from that first unit. And this is just like the snapshot of what is a much longer document, but talking about like, what is our name? And we spent a lot of time at the beginning of year getting to know people's names and the stories behind their names. How are they named what they were named? How do we say our name? Does every person in the community know your name? Welcoming and making sure that students know that there is room for people, for all people. We talked a lot about what makes us similar and what makes us different and how we celebrate our differences and how that makes us really unique, as well as this is a list of the books that we read per grade level. And the way the curriculum works is we read 1 book a week. We read it the whole way through on the first day, and then we look at pieces of that book. We read parts of the book Tuesday through Friday. And it's designed that we are actually looking at sort of these scenarios in the book and unpacking them. And then the teacher models telling some stories from her own life. And then students have chances to share stories from their life. So again, it's a story-based approach. So these are glimpses of some of the books that we read in that first unit. Um, and then there's a practical skill that accompanies each of these sort of themes. So when we read Thank You, Oma, we talked a lot about what does it mean to like share our resources, whether that's our love or time or like physical resources in a school community that would make someone feel welcomed and included. So again, they're learning practical things that they can then apply in their school community. And the last one that we've done is really trying to curate a curriculum. And this is an ongoing process given that it's our first year. So we have lots of areas for growth here, but curate a curriculum from the start that offered windows and mirrors experiences. And I heard Amber mention that earlier, that same language. So as you think about a windows experience, we want students to have the opportunity to look into different cultures and different people groups across time. And then we want mirror experiences where students are able to look at texts and lessons and stories and see themselves and their heritage reflected and affirmed in those, again, curriculums or texts. So we do take an integrated approach that is classically informed. Our second graders here are pictured, and they were studying, they did a unit on paleontology and archaeology. And their guiding question was, how do we learn about the past? So they were looking at science and fossils and what do we know about the past from sort of the fossil record. They were looking at artifacts from ancient civilizations and what can we learn about ancient civilizations as a result of studying those artifacts. They were learning about sort of hunters and gatherers and nomadic cultures and then farming cultures. And then we zoomed in on ancient Egypt. But as part of our study of ancient Egypt, we expanded the look a bit to also encompass a study of Northern Africa, its geography, and how that geography impacted how people lived then and also now. Kayla, who's our second grade teacher, was reading a book called The Butter Man, which tells the story of two generations of a Moroccan family. Storytelling as they were making couscous, and our students were all tasting couscous as they were listening to this story. And they had learned a little bit about Morocco through this unit study prior to this. So the opportunity for kids to have experiences that are like multimodal. I'm tasting, I'm smelling, I'm seeing, I'm hearing, that give them those windows and mirrors experience is something that's really important too in our community. And again, as we're continuing to just found and then grow, trying to think about how we do that intentionally over time. So I'll close the presentation portion with just a quote from one of our families. When we had one of our most recent check-ins with a family member in our school community, and this particular family was coming from an environment previously where their child was significantly undereducated. She had incredible potential, but had never been taught, had never been given the tools of reading. So she came to us as a second grader as a non-reader, and didn't even have many of the foundational like letter sounds to decode. And now she's reading, and her mom told me she can't, like, we see her reading, she reads all the time in school, she won't put down books at home. But this family shared with me at the middle of the year that this school feels like home. We're not just part of a community, but we're part of a family. And that's what our deep hope is, that families would feel like this is a place where they are loved, known, and valued, and that we are a family. We're not just a school. So I appreciate the opportunity to share and tell you a little bit more about the district school. And I welcome any questions or, I'd love to engage in a conversation because, as I mentioned, we're new and still trying to grow and learn ourselves.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Jackie. Any questions? Sorry.